For 21 days in a row in November 1995, diplomats and representatives from warring factions from the former Yugoslavia were brought by the United States to an Air Force base just outside of Dayton, Ohio. Under the auspices of Secretary of State Warren Christopher and then Assistant Secretary of State Richard Holbrooke, they hammered out an important agreement. This is the story of how diplomacy is an important tool in America's foreign policy. In 1991, communist Yugoslavia fell apart in a violent civil war which broke up the country into different rival sections.
The fragile peace in Yugoslavia is more fragile than ever. Truce talks between federal officials and the Republic of Slovenia broke down again today, and the president of Yugoslavia's largest republic is warning his people to be prepared for war.
And war broke out as Slovenia broke away from Yugoslavia, and then Croatia broke away. And the Serbs, some of which lived in Croatia, did not want to leave Mother Serbia, which was still part of Yugoslavia, so they violently rebelled against the Croats in Croatia. Some of the worst fighting was in the city of Vukovar in Croatia, where the Serbs were trying to break away and join Serbia. In March 1992, the citizens of Bosnia voted for independence from Yugoslavia, with the Muslims and Croats voting to leave that country and the Serbs boycotting the election. While the United States and its Western allies quickly recognized independent Bosnia, in April 1992, the Bosnian Serbs refused to and started rebelling. Soon the rebellious Bosnian Serbs, who controlled the hills and mountains surrounding Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, started shelling, shooting down and sniping at the citizens of the independent Bosnia in Sarajevo. Europe, the United States, and the civilized world were horrified as Sarajevo was a cosmopolitan European city that had hosted the Winter Olympics just a few years before in 1984. The United Nations Security Council reacted by passing resolutions condemning the violence and sent a few troops to try to protect civilians. But by the summer of 1995, Sarajevo was still under siege and a civil war was still happening in Bosnia. The crisis came to a head in the summer of 1995 when, despite some UN protection, the Bosnian Serb army overran the Muslim town of Srebrenica and then executed thousands of Muslim boys and men. After the horrifying events at Srebrenica, 16 nations met at a London conference on July 21, 1995 to consider new options for Bosnia. The last straw for America and its NATO allies came on August 28, 1995, when Bosnian Serbs attacked and shelled an outdoor market in downtown Sarajevo, victimizing hundreds of civilians. NATO responded. The NATO commander, Admiral Leighton Smith, recommended that NATO launch retaliatory airstrikes under Operation Deliberate Force. On August 30, 1995, Operation Deliberate Force began with large-scale bombings of the Bosnian Serb target. NATO's bombing lasted until September 20, 1995 and involved attacks in 338 targets. In the fall, together with NATO's bombing of Bosnian Serb positions, Muslim and Croat forces started reclaiming territory from the Bosnian Serbs. In September and October, the world powers, including the US and Russia, pressured the three sides in Bosnia to come to the bargaining table. The Bosnian Serbs finally relented and agreed. An Air Force base outside of Dayton, Ohio was the place where the parties agreed to meet and negotiate. At Dayton, the veteran American diplomat Richard Holbrooke led the efforts for America to negotiate for peace in Bosnia.
Well, all credit goes to the extraordinary, irrepressible, highly intelligent, and highly assertive American diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, the late Richard Holbrooke. I think he understood once we had achieved a ceasefire, after the massacre of Srebrenica, some months after the massacre, he didn't think peace was going to be possible unless we essentially locked them away and just forced them into a room to talk to each other. That led us to Dayton, Ohio.
In November 1995, Holbrooke pressured 3 presidents of the warring factions: President of the Republic of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, President of Croatia, Franjo Tuđman, and President of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Alija Izetbegović, to come together at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio. The 3 presidents had so much hatred towards each other that there was no other way but to separate them. So Holbrooke decided to employ a strategy called proximity talks.
He decided that they couldn't make peace if they talked directly to each other. And so he engaged in what he called proximity talks. We were in the officer quarter barracks at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and so the Bosnian Serbs and Serbs had one floor, and the Croats had another, and the Bosnian Muslims a third, and the Americans and Europeans and Russians a fourth. And Holbrooke literally shuttled between rooms and between floors, traveling 20 yards, 40 yards to a meeting where he would talk to each of these presidents and try to forge an agreement. And it took 21 days to do that. But he knew if they talked with each other, they just couldn't get there because the hatred and enmity was so deep from this vicious civil war that ensued as Yugoslavia was disintegrating in the early 1990s.
Curbing the participants' ability to negotiate through the media was a particularly important consideration.
He also understood that if he let them talk to the press at will, that might sink the negotiations. So he convinced them to agree that they would not talk to the press on the record, that only Holbrooke and the State Department spokesperson, that was me, would be talking on the record, and it worked.
The negotiations lasted 21 days, and every day Daytonians stood outside holding candlelight vigils. Agreement was reached at Dayton, Ohio on November 21, 1995. The final framework was achieved just 20 minutes before the talks were scheduled to end.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us. When did you know that you had a deal?
Say sometime between 10 and 10:30 this morning. We went to sleep last night having closed down the talks because each side kept changing positions, and we felt that the deadline had to be real, it had to be credible, and it wasn't a bluff. We drafted failure statements, asked each side to recommit itself to an indefinite ceasefire, passed out the statements, assembled our team, and sent them all to bed, except for one group of people whom we asked to go over and tell each president. And during the night, they went to work with each other and came back to us early in the morning with a request that we finish it up very fast.
Suzanne Nassau, who worked with Holbrooke, had this to say about her colleague.
Yeah, it was really remarkable. Here was a war that had grinded on for many years, that high-level European diplomats had tried to resolve, that America initially wanted to wash its hands of. And Holbrooke stepped in and put himself out on the line and started this shuttle diplomacy and really developed deep relationships with individual leaders, built their trust. I think he sized people up very cleverly and understood where they were coming from, what they were capable of, whether they could be trusted. And it was a remarkable process of marshaling different stakeholders in the same direction. And then, at Dayton, if you read the story of how things unfolded, just the intensity that he was able to generate, having them all hold up on that airbase and basically not allowing them to leave until they were done. And there were so many moments where it almost fell apart. So I think it was a remarkable kind of act of will and skill.
The Dayton Treaty created peace in Bosnia to this day. Secretary Warren Christopher remarked, "I trust that one day people will look back on Dayton and say, this is the place where the fundamental choices were made. This is where the parties chose peace over war, dialogue over destruction, reason over revenge. And this is where each of us accepted the challenge to make those choices meaningful and to make them endure."